H.P. Lovecraft and the Occult, a lecture series by Dr. Justin Woodman, presented at Treadwell's Bookshop, Covent Garden, London.
31st of January, 2007. The second lecture, Legends of the Necronomicon. In part 2 of this series, Justin Woodman explores the history of the legendary Necronomicon in fact and fiction, and ponders its continuing relevance to occult cultures. Penned by the Yemeni poet and mystic Abdul al-Hazred circa 700 AD, the dreaded Necronomicon is perhaps one of the most powerful and alluring of H.P. Lovecraft's creations. A grimoire able to rend apart the very fabric of reality and bring forth the great old ones themselves. Although a work of fiction, the Necronomicon has achieved a social and physical reality, with more than 20 versions having been published since the 1960s.
This is a brilliant series, and this has been sold out for 10 days. And so if you want to come next time, I think there's only about 8 places left. So we're really delighted, and I won't take up any more of his precious time, but just to say, tonight is Necronomicon, so hold on tight.
Thank you. Please just bear with me while I have all these wires and things hanging out of me. I'm trying to record this entire series of talks, and I don't quite have the extension that I need, but I'm sure that's a problem familiar to most men. Anyway, just to let you know, though, that well, it doesn't pick up. It picks up my voice okay, but it won't pick up your voices too well when it comes to questions and answers. But I'm hoping to make these files public as MP3 files sort of online. So if you have any issues about being recorded, no matter how faintly, just let me know at the end so I can edit accordingly. I'll have details of where hopefully you'll be able to find all these files eventually. But yes, just bear with me while I cope with this moment. Well, thank you very much for coming on this evening. I recognise a number of faces from last time and some new faces indeed. Before I get going, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Robin, who, yes, for gifting me this wonderful H.P. Lovecraft icon. And I mean, I'm just really blown away by this. It's a really fabulous piece of art, and that should be going up on my study wall. As indeed I do have a study, as all good Lovecraftians should. Drinking their thought and reading their obscure tomes. Anyway, thank you very much for that. And I believe, Robin, you run the events at the Devonshire Arms, don't you? And you did a Lovecraftian evening a while back, which was absolutely fantastic. And you did say you're going to be doing another one later, so look out for that. Definitely worth going to, and thank you again. Right, tonight's talk is focusing on the dreaded Necronomicon. I've changed the title, as I did last time, because I thought this was slightly more evocative. A quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, obviously from Poe's The Raven. If I could just have the first slide, please. I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but this is just an indication of various sources drawn from online of people who have claims to have read the Necronomicon and their experiences as a consequence. Necronomicon is Satan's, Lucifer's book. I mean, I just cut and paste, so all the spelling mistakes are as read. Although the writing of the Necronomicon, which does mean Book of Dead Names, was written hundreds of years before Christ, my point is that Lovecraft did not make up Necronomicon. The Book of the Dead, the spell book of hell, I know this because I have seen the book. Only 401 were published in the early 20th century before Lovecraft's career. Yes, perhaps my choice of quotes would have been slightly better here. The final one, I do not mean to offend any Wiccans here, but I think this was wonderful. Yes, Necronomicon is something not to take lightly. It's a very dangerous book, and if not used properly, it can cause your karma to go against you, which makes fate kill you in the end. It's something only an experienced Wiccan could do. I just think that's such a wonderful statement. This is really just to demonstrate the degree to which any number of people really do treat the reality of the Necronomicon as a kind of serious issue. Sorry, yes. The next one. And this is really what I want to explore in tonight's talk, the legend of Necronomicon. Now, just before I get on to the sort of history and background of this dread tome, I'd like to say a little bit about my position, my perspective on this whole issue. I mean, I do not believe that there is, or ever has been, a real or genuine Necronomicon, regardless of the numerous editions that have seen print since about the 1970s. And indeed, I'm not really going to be looking at the practical application of Necronomicon magic, or I'm not going to be looking at the practical application of Lovecraft's ideas from a magical perspective in this week's talk, at any rate. And indeed, my whole view of the relationship between Lovecraft and the occult is somewhat sceptical, I have to say. Nonetheless, both today and in some later talks, I will be exploring the magical significance of what Lovecraft has written and said. Anyway, onto the Necronomicon itself. Well, one of a sort of cornerstone of Lovecraft's whole Cthulhu mythos, and again I'm going to sort of work from the assumption that everyone here has at least a kind of working knowledge of all this. A cornerstone of the Cthulhu mythos is the notion that there is a kind of canon of forbidden or blasphemous lore, which details sort of monstrous antediluvian world of the so-called Great Old Ones, or Old Ones, these vast, monstrous, inhuman, extraterrestrial beings, which are often sort of depicted as lurking somewhere outside of the normal space-time continuum. And the lore surrounding the Old Ones is contained in a whole range of kind of black books, forbidden tomes, and so on and so forth. The most famous of which is indeed the Necronomicon, written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. Now, I'm not an Arabic scholar, but I do understand that Abdul al-Hazred doesn't really make much sense in Arabic. So this is an entirely invented name, and it was a name that was that Lovecraft picked up when he was about 5 years old. Apparently one of his relatives called him Abdul al-Hazred when he was undergoing a sort of stage of fascination with the whole Arabian Nights and so on and so forth. The Necronomicon was composed by al-Hazred in Sana around 700 AD, I think it's 730 AD actually. These are a couple of supposed depictions of the Mad Arab. The first one is actually, I believe, just a sort of general depiction of a sort of medieval Arab sorcerer. The second one is from Marvel Comics' Tarzan series, where Abdul al-Hazred turned up as a kind of supervillain, apparently. I've not read any of these, but this is just another indication, really, of the degree to which Lovecraft's whole milieu has become thoroughly embedded within popular culture. Could we move on to the next one? Now, according to Lovecraft's discussion of the Necronomicon, it was also translated by the well-known Dr. John Dee, and indeed I understand that in one of his magical diaries, or diaries concerning his whole kind of Enochian experiments with Edward Kelly, he does mention acquiring an Arabic book, which a number of people have jumped on as indication that he must have therefore possessed an actual copy of Necronomicon, regardless of the fact that there were probably a number of alchemical treatises and other Arabic books floating around Europe at that point in time. But Lovecraft does mention in his fictional history of Necronomicon that Dee was the translator of the English version. And what's interesting here, if we could get to the next one, is the way that Lovecraft has kind of facilitated the belief in his whole Cthulhu mythos through the use of realism, verisimilitude, and how this was sort of taken up by other members of the so-called Lovecraft Circle, who all in their various ways contributed to the development of this thing called the Cthulhu mythos. Now, some indicators of this here come from Lovecraft's own letters, one here from Clark Ashton Smith, written in 1930, where Lovecraft states, quote, "My own rule is that no weird story can truly produce terror unless it is devised with all the care and verisimilitude of an actual hoax. the author must build up a stark, simple account full of homely corruptive details, just as if he were actually trying to put across a deception in real life, and so on and so forth. So what Lovecraft is sort of getting at here is that in order to facilitate the suspension of disbelief, the writer of the weird tale, of the fantasy tale, has to inject a powerful element of realism into the tale. And in Lovecraft's case, this was also facilitated by the fact that people like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan, both well-known and well-established writers of weird fiction, supernatural fiction, and fantasy fiction in their own right. These two individuals, as well as a whole host of others, borrowed from Lovecraft, created their own imaginary gods, deities, their own fictional tomes. For example, Clark Ashton Smith created a book called the Book of Ebon or Ibon. Robert E. Howard created a blasphemous book called the Aussprechlichen Kulten, or Nameless Cults, which all kind of contributed to the development and evolution of this thing we know as the Cthulhu mythos. And as people were kind of encountering these cross-references, this, I guess, created a sense of a genuine mythology that was being drawn upon. Next one. Now, just to clarify Lovecraft's own position on Necronomicon, this is one of a number of letters where he does kind of clarify from his point of view the very fictional nature of this dastardly tome. 1934 he writes, regarding Necronomicon, I must confess that this monstrous and abhorred volume is merely a figment of my own imagination. Inventing horrible books is quite a pastime among devotees of the weird, and so on and so forth. Just in a sense reiterating what I was just saying. So Lovecraft himself quite clearly states that the Necronomicon is not real, and he makes no indication anywhere in his published letters that he encountered any kind of book that could be identified as the dread Necronomicon. We could go on to the next one. Oh, sorry, I think there's one just before that. Yes, yeah. And I think I'm quite pleased with myself with this. I think I've invented a new collective now, a confabulation of Necronomicons. Because, interestingly, since about the 1970s, and maybe a little bit before that, there has been an absolute plethora of books being published that claim to be Necronomicon. And I'm actually going to focus on two of those in particular today. I'm going to focus on this one, which was published by, or edited by George Hay, and introduced by Colin Wilson. Now that's any book that's introduced by Colin Wilson is worth reading. No, I mean, I do actually have a profound respect for Colin Wilson. I'll return to him later. This one is by a mysterious individual known as Simon. And this one was one of the earliest ones that I'm aware that was published, and this was by Elspraag de Camp, or sorry, Lynn Carter. So I know there's someone in here. Richard, is it? Elspraag de Camp. This was one of the first ones that was published, and it's basically page upon page of Arabic script, which is apparently completely untranslatable. It's just sort of made up, which is currently available through Amazon. But anyway, I mean, but this still is a fascinating thing about Lovecraft. And although I'm kind of denigrating the whole notion that people might actually believe that there is such a thing as an Necronomicon, I mean, that's not to say, as any number of practicing magicians who've worked with, for example, the Simon Necronomicon, have not achieved valid results from them. The issue here to me is more about the investment of belief rather than trying to establish the actual reality of such a volume. So in a sense that's where I'm coming from, and if I do cause offence in terms of my comments about the reality of Necronomicon, please bear that in mind. And just to again indicate the degree to which Necronomicon is thoroughly embedded in popular culture, you can buy a furry, cuddly Necronomicon. I think it's actually supposed to be used as a pillow. It's completely made out of soft material with actual illustrations in there. I'd love to buy a copy of this, but it's about $190 or something ridiculous. Anyway. The other thing that I would just like to point to before I go any further, because of all the talks that I'm doing as part of this series, this was one of the more difficult ones to really come up with something new and original to say. And on that point, I have to say that this book, Necronomicon Files by Daniel Harms and John Wisdom Gauntz, is really the authoritative source of information about the kind of history and occult or esoteric appropriations of Necronomicon. And if you're interested in this particular subject, go out and get a copy of this. It's still in print. And I've drawn a significant amounts of material from this, so I'm just kind of recognising my own influences and sources there. Okay, well, let's turn to the actual appearance of Necronomicon and its development and evolution in Lovecraft's work. The first actual mention of Necronomicon appears in Lovecraft's short story The Hound, which was published in 1922. However, a year prior to that, in The Nameless City, Lovecraft does mention Abdul al-Hazred and introduces what is now probably one of the best known quotes in horror fiction, that is not dead, or that is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. In The Nameless City, Lovecraft doesn't really have much to say in terms of where this couplet comes from, other than attributing it to Abdul al-Hazred, but later on in The Call of Cthulhu, one of Lovecraft's best known tales, he openly states that this actually does come from Necronomicon, and that's just a picture of the Hound, because I couldn't think of anything else to put in there. But it comes from actually a very good version of sort of Lovecraftian tarot deck. But anyway, sorry, I digress. Okay, so I mean that's just very, very briefly the first appearance of Necronomicon, and after 1922, increasingly it does appear in various of Lovecraft's stories, particularly those dealing with the Cthulhu mythos. But the question here that needs to be addressed in terms of the idea that Lovecraft may have actually been drawing on some genuine esoteric source is really to investigate the kind of historical and conceptual background of Necronomicon. So, get on to the next one, please. Now, there are a number of sources or potential influences. The first of which that's been posited is Robert Chambers' collection of short stories, The King in Yellow, a collection of sort of very broadly interconnected short stories. And one of the things that ties a number of these stories together is a play known as The King in Yellow, which reading it will basically turn you insane. I mean, Chambers is kind of very sort of indirect in terms of exactly what it is about this play, The King in Yellow, which will send you insane. But it's been postulated that Lovecraft actually drew from Chambers' work as a kind of inspiration for The King in Yellow. And to a certain extent, I think this is true, but actually Lovecraft invented the Necronomicon some 5 years, or 6 years, I believe, before he encountered Chambers' work, this particular book, The King in Yellow, which I think he first read in 1927. After which he did actually seem to incorporate some ideas from The King in Yellow into his broader conception of the Necronomicon. But this doesn't seem to be a direct source. The other source that esotericists have often referred to as a potential inspiration is Blavatsky's stanzas of Jian, I don't know if that's a correct pronunciation, which are themselves, I think, open to sort of speculation as to whether these actually exist or not. I'm not really that familiar with the background and history of theosophy, but my understanding is that this is another kind of invented book, and it's kind of be interesting to think that Lovecraft created an invented book based on another invented book. But indeed, Lovecraft was only aware of the Book of Jian, or the stanzas of Jian. He did actually reference it in some of his later stories, but this was in 1933, I think, was the first time he'd actually heard about it, again, a good 11 or 12 years after he'd actually invented the Necronomicon. To the next one, please. Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher has been posited as another source, because there's a passage in there in which Poe lists a whole range of extant occult volumes as a way of kind of evoking a mood. And this is a point raised by Dan Harms and John Gontz, actually. This may be one of Lovecraft's kind of original sources, because Lovecraft was a huge Poe aficionado. The other thing that came to my mind, actually, was that it may have also come from the poem The Raven, because there is talk of quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, which I used as a quote at the beginning of my talk. So that might have been another kind of spark of inspiration for Lovecraft. Next one. Lovecraft offers his own account, which actually only appears very later on in life, although at various points throughout his letters, his published letters, which range from about, I think, 1914 to his death in 1937. I mean, he continually reiterates the fictive nature of Necronomicon, but in around, I think, 1936, he actually mentions that the name Necronomicon, he actually uses the Greek here, which I sort of translated, necros, corpse, nomos, law, icon, image, an image or picture of the law of the dead, occurred to me in the course of a dream, although the etymology is perfectly sound. Apparently the etymology actually isn't perfectly sound, because what it should what Necronomicon should translate as is something like, I've forgotten now, it's something of the dead. It's in my notes somewhere, but I'm not going to bother to pour through to dig it out. Anyway, S.T. Joshi, who's one of the kind of preeminent Lovecraftian scholars, I think it's concerning the dead. That's how it should translate. And he was apparently a sort of classical scholar and knew Greek very well. The other title of Necronomicon, because of course this is the Greek name for it, was Al-Azif, and this is mentioned in one or two of Lovecraft's stories. And this is actually taken directly from a scholarly note to William Beckford's tale of Oriental horror, Varthek, and that being Beckford there, and where Al-Azif means the howling of demons. So there are two sort of clear literary sources that Lovecraft admits to drawing from. This one, I think, is, those of you who were here for my last talk, where I was kind of talking about shamanic elements of Lovecraft's life and experience. I mean, I think this is kind of interesting, and if you're looking for an explanation of where the Necronomicon comes from in terms of a kind of genuine occult artifact, the notion that it came to him in a dream, I think, is something worth dwelling upon, and something I'll return to later on this evening. Classical sources also, which Joshi indicates. Two sources in particular, an astronomical work written by Ptolemy called Megale Syntaxis Tes Astronomias, which I have no idea what that means, but it's an astronomical work at any rate, or so I'm told. And indeed a poem, a Latin poem it's been dated to the 1st century, called the Astronomicon by a character called Manilius. And it was a poem which Lovecraft was familiar, and I believe he does cite in his letters. So I think that's kind of interesting also, because it ties into the kind of cosmic perspective which manifests in much of Lovecraft's writing, the concern with vast sort of swathes of space and time, of intergalactic distance, of beings that filter down from the stars, and so on and so forth. And of course Lovecraft was something of an amateur astronomer, and indeed at a very early age was publishing articles in his local newspaper in Providence on astronomy. So I think these are perhaps more likely sources than actual occult poems. But just to compound the presumed reality of the Necronomicon, Lovecraft did himself create a kind of background story, which has been published in numerous places under the title A History of Necronomicon. This is a copy of an image of the actual manuscript itself. And this was first drafted in 1927, but the version that has been widely published was sent to one of Lovecraft's correspondents, Willis Conover, in 1936. And it's only a couple of pages long, actually, but it kind of, again, as with Dr. John Dee, Lovecraft draws on a range of actual historical sources here. So it's that kind of infusion of the fictive, the fictional with the factual, which kind of, I guess, confuses the issue, that gives this, or creates a sense of verisimilitude that makes the idea of the Necronomicon believable. But I'd also suggest that the Necronomicon is only believable because it resonates in particular ways with the here and now, and that's something that I will explore towards the end of my talk. Next one, please. Now, in terms of what the Necronomicon contains, we are left with very little to speculate on, unfortunately. There are, according to Lovecraft, at least 751 pages in the book, presumably a few more. And only a few passages are actually quoted. Now, I thought about this today, I didn't really have a chance to check it. I'm only, off the top of my head, I can only think of 3 passages that Lovecraft quotes in the entirety of his short stories at any rate. The first one, which is perhaps one of the most famous, comes from his short story, The Dunwich Horror, which in some sense encapsulates the idea of the Necronomicon, that it's a book about calling forth the old ones, these monstrous beings from beyond space and time. That it's a book of lore concerning the old ones that contains spells or formulae by which they can be made manifest in our space and time. And that it, in a sense, it's an apocalyptic book. It's apocalyptic not only in the sense that it is revealing secrets about the past history of this planet, but in the more casual sense, or the sort of everyday sense, that it's a book that heralds the end of the human species and the end of this planet as in its entirety, if you like, which is, in a sense, the underlying threat within many of Lovecraft's stories. So this is really all we know. And the book itself, off the top of my head, again, I can only recall that it actually appears physically in one story, which is the Dunwich Horror. Or I think there are a few other minor appearances in other stories and fragments. In most other cases, it's just kind of referred to. It lurks in the background, and as such, I refer to it as a floating signifier. This is a term that comes from the work of anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. It's simply the idea that it is an idea that has no real-world reference, and as such, it can sort of mean whatever you want it to mean, and that, in a sense, is the power of the Necronomicon, and why I think it has become such a significant theme running through contemporary cultural ideas and practices. What's the next one? So, I've dealt in some detail, I think, with the idea, the concept of the Necronomicon, some of its sources. So let's get on to the actual occult Necronomicon, how it's been used or deployed in actual magical practice. There are a vast number of Necronomicons out there, it has to be said. There are at least 20 that have been published since the 1970s, many of which actually only appear in non-English editions. Given the scope of this, I'm only going to really deal with 3 actual published Necronomicons and one other individual who I think is of fundamental importance to the manifestation of this myth. And indeed, now I'm talking about Necronomicon as a myth, but obviously it's not a myth because you can buy it in any bookshop, or sorry, I don't know if you say it, but you can buy it in any Treadwells. You can buy it, sorry, not Treadwells, the big chain, Waterstones. Apologies. So it's a reality. There's no doubt about this, and it's a social and cultural reality. There have been at least 3 or 4 cases in which this particular version of Necronomicon has been cited as an influence on so-called satanic crime. It's been cited as a kind of motivating force. So in that respect, it's a social, cultural, and a physical reality. I'm not denying that whatsoever. But there are other aspects about the provenance of the Necronomicon which I do have kind of issues with. But let's start with Kenneth Grant. I mean, I'm kind of assuming at least a minimal familiarity with our good friend Kenneth Grant. And again, regardless of what I may have to say about him, I have huge and profound respect for his work. I mean, I'm not a big Thelemite, or I kind of can sort of give or take Thelema. I mean, I'm sort of interested in it, but in terms of Thelemic thinking, Thelemic writing, Kenneth Grant is the kind of top bloke as far as I'm concerned. And I think he had the right idea in some respects by positing the Necronomicon as a real but non-physical entity or artifact. I mean, I have to admit, I don't believe this myself. I am very much a skeptic on this issue. I don't believe this myself. But if that's the way to go, I think that's given the visionary background to Lovecraft's writing, I think you could sort of posit this as a potential source of some genuine occult reality. His book Magical Revival, published in 1972, is a place where I think the modern history of Lovecraftian occultism starts in some respects. It can be traced back further than this, but the kind of flowering of Lovecraftian magic really, I think, begins with Kenneth Grant. But in the Magical Revival, if you're familiar with that book, he does make various comparisons between Crowley's Thelema and Thelemic Kabbalistics and Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. None of which really convinced me, I have to say. And definitely the fact that the Book of the Law is an Necronomicon doesn't hold that much weight. I mean, it doesn't have 751 pages at any rate, if you're going to work from this literally. Having said that, I think there is a sense, and I think it's something that Grant himself admits to, that you could see Liber Book of the Law as being an Necronomicon because it's about transgression, it's about overthrowing not just the established social and political order, but the conceptual order. It's about seeing the world in a radically new way, from an alien perspective, if you like. And I think this is very much what the Necronomicon is telling us, or this is, as a myth, as a metaphor or symbol, this is what it's all about. So in some respects, I can kind of take that as a metaphorical truth, not necessarily a literal one. I think the only problem here is that Grant's argument is sometimes a little bit circular. He's kind of, in places, seems dedicated to reinforcing the Lovecraft-Crowley link. And to do this, he has to kind of posit the existence of an astral or Akashic Necronomicon, the Akashic record from Theosophy. That's, I'm sure you know what it is, so I won't tell you what it is. So, in this respect, in order to legitimise that link between Crowley and Lovecraft, he has to create the Akashic Necronomicon. Now, what's the circularity to this? Oh, God, I probably shouldn't have gone into this one because I've forgotten what I was trying to say. Hold on, just give me a moment. I've highlighted it here because I knew I was going to have problems with this, the way I can do with circular arguments. Oh, God. Okay, right, that's not good. It's right, it should, with a bit of luck, just come straight back on. No, it's shutting down. Okay. Yeah, if you don't mind.
It's because you bad-mouthed Kenneth Grant.
Yeah. Let's try cancel. Okay, I can't find a bit about circular arguments, so I'll ask me about it in the questions. And I think that's I have a feeling that this might not have recorded, so you're in a unique position to have witnessed a one-off event.
It's a whole philosophical school for you.
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's just leave the circular argument behind for the moment, because I'll just end up getting myself in a fix. But yes, if we can move on to the next one. What's interesting about Grant, though, is the way that he kind of introduced the whole issue of extraterrestrialism into magical thinking. Well, I would say he introduces extraterrestrialism into magical thinking. I mean, it's been there prior to Grant, but I think I would say Grant is one of the kind of popularizers of this idea. And his whole kind of Typhonian trilogies, if you are if you're familiar with those, often deal with this kind of exegesis of Crowley's writings, or an interpretation of them, which kind of looks at Crowley's magical system as comparable or identical with Lovecraft's writing. It's all about communing with entities, extraterrestrial or preternatural entities, which are identical with Lovecraft's old ones. And I mean, I just put Lamb there because in some respects he seems to be very much a kind of prefiguring of the whole kind of extraterrestrial grey image, which prefigures the emergence of ufology and the merging of esoteric currents with ufological thinking from 1970s onwards. What's the next one? Now, one thing that did strike me about this, this idea of the Necronomicon as a kind of revealed text, or the whole idea of Necronomicon as a kind of secret text, was that it does tie into the work of the French thinker Michel Foucault. Now, I wasn't sure whether I wanted really to go. I'm not going to go into it in any detail because I just struggle with Foucault at best of times anyway. But some of his ideas do seem pertinent here, so I just want to make a bit of a kind of more sort of mainstream academic digression. And I was thinking, Foucault's idea is that power and knowledge are intimately related. Not so much in the way that Nietzsche talks about, power is knowledge or whatever, but in the way that systems of power shape the content of systems of knowledge. That I guess it's the whole George Orwell 1984 thing. That reality is shaped by those in power, or history is written by the winners, if you like. And the idea that springs to mind here in relation to Necronomicon is the ways in which secrecy seems to be a kind of key currency in what I call an occult economy, that especially in kind of initiatory traditions, where there are gatekeepers to illumination, enlightenment, to secret knowledge. And the whole idea of revealed texts, etheric texts, channeled books, and so on and so forth seems to be, from a very kind of practical point of view, a very good method of social control, or of controlling, your group, if you like, because those who have access to the secrets, in a sense, are able to define the truth, and they have power over those who don't have access to the secrets. So I was just kind of thinking a little bit sociologically about this, that perhaps one of the reasons why the Necronomicon is so popular as a kind of magical concept is that it facilitates the exercise of power in all sorts of ways. But I think I'll move on from that now, because that's just something that sprang to mind, and I'd like to explore it later date. What I want to address now is the ways in which the Necronomicon as an idea, and Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos more generally, have kind of made themselves manifest. I am going to eject this because I'm pretty sure it's not working now. At a particular point in time in European and American history, if you like. And one of the claims I'm going to make today, and something that follows through, that really sort of comes from my previous talk and will run through later talks, is the notion that the 1970s in particular constituted a watershed in the flourishing of what I've called Lovecraftian occulture, where occulture, again, I'm using as a kind of umbrella term for a whole range of things, whether it's kind of ritual magic, ufology, and so on and so forth, things that I refer to as stigmatized or rejected knowledges. And this was the period of necronomophilia, as I like to call it, where you had the flourishing of Necronomicons, widespread publication of a whole range of Necronomicons. So there were a few before this time, but I think that that's a significant historical point that needs to be addressed. This was at the time not only Kenneth Grant but also Anton LaVey, Timothy Leary. Well, no, not Timothy Leary. Grant and LaVey in particular were exploring some of the occult dimensions of Lovecraft's work. I mean, not the Satanic Bible, but the Satanic Rituals does contain numerous references to Lovecraft. I think there might be some in the Satanic Bible. I haven't done my research on that, actually. Now, I'm not entirely sure here if LaVey is responsible or if it's Michael Aquino, who seems to be who was the schismatic offshoot of the Temple of Set from the Church of Satan, led by Aquino. And Aquino seems to be much more engaged with some of Lovecraft's thinking, so I don't really know enough about the history of the Satanic Rituals, but I suspect that Aquino might have been responsible for writing the more Lovecraftian aspects of this. But nonetheless, I mean, what both Grant and LaVey really talk about, and the quote that comes to mind here from LaVey is the notion that the great Lovecraft's great old ones are a kind of, or it's a paraphrase, are a prefiguring of a future human mentality. They are pointing towards a post-human condition, if you like. And I think Grant is saying the same in some respects, that magical engagements with the great old ones are, we're not dealing with, we're dealing with a kind of issue of perspective here, that the monstrousness of these beings is due to the fact that from a human framework we cannot make sense of them. But by engaging with them and trying to incorporate that monstrousness, that alienness within ourselves, we become something new, something different. We become the alien. And I think that's significant in this moment in time, because this is where you have the real explosion of interest in popular ufology. I mean, of course, ufology was around prior to this time, but you have the advent of von Daniken, the whole ancient astronaut thesis, which is pure Lovecraft. And this is going to be the theme for my next talk. I mean, I don't think you can pin it down entirely to Lovecraft, but I think so much of that whole idea comes from Lovecraft, because this is fundamental to many of his stories, that human beings are only here because we are products of extraterrestrial civilizations which existed on this planet millions of years prior to our existence. This is also a time of the 60s and 70s, 60s in particular, a time of rapid social change. The first, the first moon landings were occurring at this point in time. A kind of cultural shift where I would say people are becoming more and more aware of their position within a kind of Copernican universe. That the universe was a much broader thing. That they were aware of the notion that human beings were potentially making their first steps into space. And this is reflected in the emergent mythologies of the time, which are still with us today. The notion of a kind of extraterrestrialist spirituality. What's also interesting is that during the 1970s, and it's not a huge number over the period of an entire decade, but during the 1970s, over 2 million paperback copies of Lovecraft's work were sold in North America. I'm not sure how many were sold in Europe, but so that oh dear. Okay, I'm going to try one last time. I do apologise.
Remind me about land.
Yeah.
No, what I've done is I've found a reasonable reproduction on the web.
Hey!
So I've got a couple of quite good copies.
The good news is I'll only be using this for one more of my emails. It's good when it works. I mean,
it's daunting to see how troublesome it is.
This is one of those things. I use it almost on a daily basis in my sort of teaching, but virtually every time I do something outside of the classroom, it just never works.
Just need to shut off the standby settings.
Oh, right,
So
okay.
you just go on standby because you haven't done anything.
Right, okay. Well, that will just encourage me to
go through it quickly.
Okay, so let's have a look finally at some of the two of the kind of dominant Necronomicons that manifest during this period of time. Starting with that so-called edited by George Hay, who I think was involved in kind of science fiction literature, an editor of science fiction magazines and short story collections. Robert Turner, who was I think a practicing occultist, and of course Colin Wilson. Published in 1978 by Neville Spearman, I think in hardback initially, and then in 1918 paperback. We could. What's the next one? Oh no! Now I don't know what's happened here. Oh yes, right, yes, yeah. Just lost my train of thought there. This Necronomicon isn't really convincing because it's a bunch of articles and essays about Necronomicon with about 30 pages stuck in the middle claiming to be the actual Necronomicon. Now again, given that the book is supposed to be a minimum of 751 pages long, it doesn't really convince. Although having said that, the 30 pages or so are they're quite Lovecraftian. It's quite a good spin, I think, on Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. They treat the material fairly well. But the main claim that comes out of this book is that Lovecraft actually encountered and read a real, genuine Necronomicon, and he did so via Freemasonry. Insofar as Colin Wilson claims that Lovecraft's father, his name escapes me now, Richard, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, yeah, it ends with Lovecraft anyway. Anyway, his father was a Freemason, and via his connections with Freemasonry, had access to a genuine Necronomicon, which Lovecraft perused as a child, as you do, and then created this rich mythology drawn from an actual extant mythological source, if you like. There's no evidence to support this. However, Whipple Phillips, who we see here, Lovecraft's grandfather, which is a point that Wilson fails to catch on, was actually quite a high-ranking Freemason, and indeed established a Masonic hall in the aptly named hamlet of Coffin's Corner in New England. But even so, I mean, Lovecraft, I think, really saw his grandfather as much more a father figure than his real father, because his real father was really not on the scene much of the time, and died probably of syphilis in early on in Lovecraft's life. But there's no mention, other than a passing reference to Whipple Phillips' involvement in Freemasonry, that he had any sort of connection with the Necronomicon. Of course, the skeptics would say, well, he wouldn't say that anyway, would he? He would be hiding it. But if he'd be hiding it, well, why is he writing about it in the first place? But anyway. Regardless of all this, Wilson eventually did admit that this was the whole thing was a hoax, if it wasn't evident already. Going to the next one. However, there's an interesting follow-up to this. There are a couple of points that I just want to tease out of the Wilson-Hay-Turner Necronomicon. And the first one is that in this book, and also in Colin Wilson's later writings around Lovecraft, because he himself wrote, I think, 3 novels which were kind of based broadly within the Cthulhu mythos and a few short stories. It's really interesting because Wilson applies his own kind of quite existentialist, what I call rationalising, psychologizing approach to the Cthulhu mythos. One that also follows somewhat from Grant, that he kind of sees encounters with the great old ones as a kind of bootstrapping of human consciousness, as a way of kind of opening up. It tends to treat the monstrous beings of the Cthulhu mythos as kind of lurking psychological forces which human beings have to kind of address and deal with before they make the next kind of psychic evolutionary step and uncover faculty X, as Wilson puts it. And I think that's really, really kind of interesting, because he's giving, again, a very modern spin on what is already a very modern mythology. More of that towards the end. But the other point about Wilson, which I find quite intriguing, is that in 1992 he published an article in the Scoob Esoteric Review entitled Tentacles Across Time, where he actually seems to make a 180-degree turn on Lovecraft. He's sort of saying initially, well, we published this Necronomicon as entirely as a hoax. Wilson didn't really have that much complimentary to say about Lovecraft in some of his earlier writings, but in this article he actually seems to suggest that he's come to believe that there is an authentic esoteric reality underlying Lovecraft's writing. I don't know what to make of that myself, but I'm just kind of bringing it to your attention if it's something you weren't aware of. We can move on to the next one. And also Wilson interestingly makes a comparison with the Voynich manuscript. In one of his short stories, and I think in one of his novels, he actually claims that the Voynich manuscript is in fact the Necronomicon. And that's, I'm not quite sure why I included that really. It's just another sort of reflection on the way that secret books or books which remain untranslatable really capture our imagination. You know, there's still this kind of fascination with the mystery that inheres in these kind of artifacts. The final and probably best known Necronomicon by this individual calling himself Simon, which has reputedly sold over 1 million copies since about the late 1970s, 1980s. And indeed, apparently, a significant number of copies have been sold to members of the American military. That's an anecdotal thing that I've heard. I don't know where that came from, whether there's any truth to it whatsoever, but one wonders what they're doing in Area 51. These days, is they've got, or probably burning piles of Necronomicons too. Cut down on the fuel bills. This is posited. Basically, the story behind this is that 2 monks from the Autocephalic Slavonic Catholic Church, some obscure Christian sect at any rate, had been working their way around most of North America's best-known libraries and basically pinching stuff like valuable manuscripts, and had come across this manuscript which they then passed on to Simon, which according to him turned out to be the Necronomicon. And this whole book is basically something of a mishmash of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian mythology with some Lovecraftian names thrown in. Although this is the book that many practicing magicians who've used it do claim to have had some remarkable results from. But again, there's really no evidence to suggest that this is anything other than a fairly poor fake, to be honest. This elder sign here, which is supposed to be an archaic pre-human representation of the old ones, was actually created by an esoteric artist called Ken Kagan in the 1970s, and it's well, if we can have the next it's appeared in any number of horrifying contexts ever since. I have no idea whether I stumbled across this online. I have no idea where this comes from, or even if it's genuine, but there you go. Next one, please. The other thing about this Necronomicon is that it actually managed to garner a quote on the back cover from a good friend William Burroughs, who's apparently also said this is a dangerous book, the theological equivalent of a loaded gun, which is quite appropriate coming from Burroughs, I suppose. And he says, "Let the secrets of the ages be revealed. The publication of Necronomicon may well be a landmark in the liberation of the human spirit." I kind of somewhat think that Burroughs' tongue may be firmly in his cheek at this point in time. Having said that, though, Burroughs actually does quote from the Simon Necronomicon in at least one of his novels, the Place of Dead Roads, where he also actually cuts and pastes bits from a Cthulhu mythos story by Frank Belknap Long. So presumably Burroughs was kind of, had some awareness or knowledge of Lovecraft. I haven't encountered any reference to this in any of the sort of standard biographies of Burroughs. But he was himself very interested in kind of science fiction, so on and so forth, and how that was a kind of visionary literature. So I think also to a certain extent the inclusion of Burroughs on the blurb probably, particularly amongst countercultural circles, added some weight to the veracity of the Simon Necronomicon. This is why it's not real, in my opinion. first of all, if you've read the book, I mean, the story that it tells is straight from August Derleth's reworking of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Derleth was a Catholic, and he didn't really like Lovecraft's nihilistic, atheistic take on things. So he kind of reworked the Cthulhu mythos to incorporate his idea of the great old ones who were in combat with the forces of sort of cosmic good. So if this is supposed to be an authentic manifestation of the Necronomicon that Lovecraft was writing about, it doesn't really fit the bill. As I said, it's a bit of a mixture of Sumerian, Babylonian sources with a few Lovecraftian names added to the mix, and I think truly alien. And this also follows Grant in various ways by claiming that there are clear associations between Lovecraft and Crowley, and that they were both involved in the rediscovery of an ancient Sumerian tradition. But there's no evidence of this in Lovecraft, his letters or his writing. That I think he makes occasional references to Babylonian Sumerian mythology, but certainly in his short stories, his novels, there's no sense that he was that knowledgeable about Sumerian mythic traditions. I had another. I mean, no, I thought I had another point to make about that, but I don't. Let's go on to the next one. Even so, though, I would say, from a certain perspective, that this is still a valuable book. That the introduction, I mean, the text itself, I'm not sure about, but the introduction and some narrative surrounding the aspects of the book which claim to be the real Necronomicon are quite interesting in terms of how they situate the Necronomicon in terms of kind of the rapid social change, notions of apocalyptic ecological disaster, which we're really kind of reaping the benefits of at the moment and will be doing so in years to come, and how this is all kind of manifestation of, well, I said, in modernity's instrumental rationality. And Simon talks about the old ones, or referred to in the text as the ancient ones, again in terms of the extraterrestrial, the alien, or in terms of psychology. So it's a very kind of modernizing spin on a so-called archaic mythology. And in doing so, again, it's kind of creating a new myth for a modern age where, well, if I actually go on to the final, I think it's the final slide, hopefully this will sort of come through. As I said, that none of these Necronomicons are real in inverted commas, and there's an online scholar who's had some really interesting things to say about Necronomicon, called Colin Lowe, and just to quote here, Necronomicon, hinted at from the contextual framework of Lovecraft's fiction, is not a book that could have existed in the ancient world. It is an outcome of Lovecraft's modern consciousness of the universe. And this, to me, is the real reason why there is not a real Necronomicon, because the Necronomicon is a book about which is articulating a thoroughly modern post-Copernican mindset, a very kind of secular, technologized, extraterrestrial way of looking at things. And what Lowe's pointing out here is the fact that prior to probably the 18th century, or at least the Protestant Reformation, you simply wouldn't have had that mindset, at least in the European context at any rate. So the value of these Necronomicons, I think, lies in the fact that what they've done is to create, taken elements of Lovecraft's pseudo-mythology and created what I call a mythology of modernity. I'll explain that term later on in the series of the talks. But particularly in terms of how they've kind of reframed, I think, a very human need for myth, a human need for the otherworldly, or to explore hypothetical otherworlds in a way that's very fitting to the here and now. And this is the point at which it really kind of overlaps, where the whole Necronomicon myth, Lovecraft's work, ties in with the whole ancient astronaut thing, which is going to be the focus of my next talk. And I'll just repeat this. My conclusion is that the Necronomicon is a kind of floating signifier. It's something that is so ill-defined that it can mean virtually anything. But what it does is also to hold up a sort of mirror to the alienation, I suppose, experienced within the kind of modern human consciousness, that we live in a technologized, secularized world. But this has, in a sense, disenchanted the world that we live in, that by our very nature we are seeking some deeper meaning. And I mean, in some respects this is kind of paradoxical, because Lovecraft's whole mythology is saying, well, there is no meaning. But that doesn't fit very well with most of us, and I think in all sorts of interesting ways, and ways that fit very pertinently with the cultural context and the social context that we find ourselves in here and now. Lovecraft has indeed created a new mythology for us all, maybe. I don't know. I'll bring it to a close there.
I'm not the floating signifier. I'm the floating compare. Thank you. If you have questions, the way we do them here, if you've been before, you're familiar with this. Is it wave your hand and I'll sort of point and we'll do them in order. And I'm going to just take the privilege of being compare and ask the first one, which is the thing that two things really struck me. One is, of which I'll just mention the one. One is, and that is to do with the book as a powerful object. You know, it has the secrets of the universe, but it can drive you mad. You know, people go crazy on these things. They're so powerful. They'll shatter your world. But at the same time, if you have it and you read it, you are incredibly powerful. And I think there's just that relationship between fear and power, or like something that will blow your mind apart, that can summon up demons or invoke this whole kind of, you will know these old ones and beings, but your mind might crack apart, but you will have the real secrets of the universe. I mean, that's, if anybody else has been in the occult world, I think we're kind of familiar with that. Those kind of claims. And then the other thing I think is kind of interesting, there's another kind of power for the person who says, aha, but I'm going to reveal everything. They're the power of the people who don't reveal, but have it. And then there's the power of people who say, but it's published by me, $7.99, or here's the Gardnerian Book of Shadows on my website. It's a different kind of power there. Now, so I was interested in your publishing people, and I wonder if, just your thoughts on the fact that he didn't publish it meant that it could contain everybody's fears and everybody's hopes for power. If he'd published this thing, he'd be like, but because it's almost like making me think of Psycho. You never see the murderer, and it's all scarier because you don't. So, I don't know, over to you, and then Phil wants to come in.
No, I agree entirely, and I think that's precisely how Lovecraft envisioned the Necronomicon as this kind of evocative symbol that floats through his work. It's kind of it suggests so much, and but never actually reveals anything concretely, because Lovecraft quite astutely, I think, realised that he has this reputation of sort of using adjectives like undescribable and unnameable, which he does in some of his early works, and the sort of notion that he was a bad writer because he wasn't able to describe the ultimate horrors. I mean, actually, he does describe some of those horrors, and he does it quite well, but I think that's where the Necronomicon comes in, as this kind of point of revelation, which is, I was saying it's a kind of mirror to modern consciousness. It's a mirror to our own fears, I think. So I'd agree entirely in that respect.
Okay, hands. Okay, first Phil, and then Rob.
Just to further that point, actually, I think Robert M. Price describes the Necronomicon at some point as a hall of mirrors. It does very well what you just said. It sidles up towards the ultimate horror, then backs away and provides a space for the reader to fill in the blanks, as it were. But something that struck me on several occasions is if you want to see that done in respect in say religious studies, is if you look at 19th century missionary writing about Tantra, where missionaries will actually use exactly the same devices. They will say, the Hindus then go off into the graveyard and do something that I'm going to write in Latin, or another famous anecdote is I think the Abbé Voulan saying that, the Abbé Dubois, I cannot reveal these mysteries as they are not fit to be spoken, to be written on before a Christian public, which of course allows the public to fill in the blank. There's a few urbans actually to look at that if you want to look at the whole kind of like Orientalist way of sidling into the tantric secret and not revealing it, but revealing it by inference.
Just reflecting on that, one of the things that is kind of interesting about how Lovecraft deals with Necronomicon is actually the kind of use of religious language in a negative sense, in the sense that it's a blasphemous book as well, which is, I think Robert M. Price actually talks about Lovecraft's use of the term blasphemy more in the sense of something which undermines the so-called natural order of things, but in fact it's just a human perception of the natural order of things. I'd like to sort of ruminate on that a bit.
I appear to have intercepted your circular logic thing, but unfortunately I haven't read any Grant, so I have to turn it on you. I'm afraid. I was interested in your conclusion about the floating signifier, because I think perhaps you're open to a logical danger there of fixing it as floating, if that makes sense. So it's sort of it floats, therefore we don't need to look at what it could be because we know that it could go anywhere, so we won't look where it goes, if that makes sense to you. Because I think that accounts for maybe the uneasiness you had with Wilson's apparent conversion, because it seemed to me that what he was doing was using the Necronomicon as an idea in the most obvious way to use it, which is convert it to the audience that you're speaking to, because every audience is going to have a different need. So I just wanted to make sure that in concluding, you weren't stopping, if that makes sense. In concluding that it's floating, are you fixing?
I probably am, actually, in some respects. I'm not. To be honest, I'm not quite sure I entirely follow what you're getting at. But no. I am in the sense that I am personally, at any rate, sort of committed to the idea that there is. I'm not sure I understand. Are you suggesting that maybe
I'm suggesting that it might only be a floating signifier for as long as it's a floating signifier, and then it will be something else? Does that make sense?
That does make sense, but some clarification of, obviously you can't say what something else might be.
Of course, because it's nameless.
Are there things that it couldn't signify? I don't know if
By saying it couldn't signify anything, are there things that you're shutting yourself off from interpreting? Had that to you?
That hadn't occurred to me, but you're probably quite right, actually, yes.
It's a good.
Okay, right, we're going to do this. Ed.
I just wanted to go on from that. The fact that, you have blasphemous books, Necronomicon, as you've said, the fact that it doesn't exist gives it more power. Because if you get a book, say, for instance, like the Gospel of Judas, which came out recently, and this is yet another in a long line of books that's supposed to blow apart the whole of Christianity, and everybody kind of looks at it and thinks, yeah, so what? And I just wondered whether, in fact, there could be any such book that would actually upset people. I don't know whether the Gospel of Judas did upset people, because it wouldn't bother me. But whether any sort of fact about the world, particularly an historical fact about the world, could actually upset anyone. Whereas with your akashic, ethereal tome.
I would sort of actually perhaps not ask Phil to respond, but turn to something that I recall Phil says in his Pseudonomicon about that any real factual Necronomicon can't help but disappoint, because the blasphemous knowledge just isn't there, because it's being conceptualized within a framework which has to be taken in by human beings, and in a sense, I think, again, I'm probably not going to be able to give a very clear or good answer to that question, but this is something I'm going to try and address in the final part of the series. But the idea that what Lovecraftian magic is perhaps best used for is a way of, as a kind of conceptual transgression which goes beyond language, that goes beyond the physical and the spoken and that which can be articulated, which I don't know how I'm going to deal with that in the talk, but I'm going to...
Okay. All right, then, Robin and then Vinay.
Yeah, just on this very note of like it being a book which is definable in response, literally, to the last question. In Lovecraft's own words, the oldest and greatest fear of mankind is the fear of the unknown, which is precisely what he was writing about all the time. And he was deliberately writing a scientific mythology which was beyond the constraints of human knowledge. And thus a book that defied ancient constraints and also modern constraints that he could cite as being a reference book, which if it exists, therefore you can't get your hands on it, therefore you can't reference it, therefore it's unknowable, and therefore the contents are horrific. As soon as you start defining those contents, you start making it material, which is precisely the opposite of his aim.
Yeah, yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Can I just agree with that? I have to. I apologise. I'm really crap at questions.
That's fine. That's fine. We love you. We love you. You're fine as you are. That's fine. Vinay.
I'm not giving value for money. That's all.
No. You're already there. We had pictures, and you're great.
Right.
It's fine.
Okay.
Vinay and then Michael. Vinay.
Okay, you mentioned about Kenneth Grant. Kenneth Grant uses it in a major way with in the Ninth Gate, for example, with voodoo as well, and other aspects. Now, what comes across to me is because it's blasphemous, because it's not read, it's not there. It's a form of gnosis.
Oh yes, yeah.
Right? And that's the whole point about it. At the end of the day, you can find a book like the Bible, or the Bible. People follow it end to end and make create a lore, and you have some sort of like logical progression. Because it's not written down as fact, form. Gnosis occurs, and gnosis is individual. All right, your gnosis is different from my gnosis. And that's the whole point about it. You can say this is the real Necronomicon, this is the real Necronomicon. Anything which is written on paper is not real. Anything which helps you to gain the gnosis is real. And I think Lovecraft used it in the best way, which is basically through story. Through stories. I mean, at the end of the day, any old religions use stories. Your information is passed on from child to, from parent to child, so through stories, and it's up to you, your imagination, to form some sort of gnosis. That's it. Period. So
I entirely agree, and that, in terms of the application of a kind of Lovecraftian methodology, if you like, to magical practice, that would certainly be for me the way to go. I've kind of been, I haven't been dealing with the practical aspects of this directly because I have had quite a bit of experience with it over a period of about 4 years with one group that I was working with, but I've kind of very much drifted away, I suppose, from a magical point of view to a much more sceptical point of view. So I'm just kind of thinking about how I'm going to be dealing with that. But certainly what came out of my working with this group was that very point, that it was, in some sense, that was the difficulty, that it was so individual. It was, once you pin it down, you lose it, exactly, yeah.
You talked about the plethora of works which have already been written. There's something called Metal Sushi, you may have heard of, by David Conway. Fantastic piece of work in relation to the future elements of Lovecraft. It is excellent. You get a chance to get a hold of Metal Sushi, and that really did it for me because it talks about nanotechnology.
Right,
it talks about other elements, which is like, okay.
Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, I'm picking up on some of the Robin said, that what Lovecraft created was a sort of rationalist, scientific, almost an atheistic mythology, in that the great old ones in the Necronomicon were extraterrestrial creatures. Humanity to them would be as an ant to us. We can't understand them. They're totally beyond our knowledge, but they are not really supernatural creatures because they belong to the universe. Whether they created the universe is open to question. And I find it interesting that people using Necronomicon, it's become something like some over reality, and it has been a creative reality to a lot of people. And I think I can actually see where people are using this for ritual magic purposes, and therefore it becomes real. And I just think that Lovecraft would have taken quite a bit of amusement.
Oh, undoubtedly,
when he was alive, people were writing to him claiming to have actually read the book. He found it very strange and quite funny. But yeah, things people want to believe in, they become real, and therefore somewhere there is Necronomicon. If they're using it, people use it for these purposes.
I mean, just to sort of comment on
the mind.
Sorry?
A Necronomicon
of the mind, yeah. I mean, just to sort of comment on that, I think that's, to be honest, that's why I sort of often take issue personally with magical uses of Lovecraft, because Lovecraft's universe is not a magical universe. There are spells, but they're advanced alien science. Perhaps you could work that into a kind of magical methodology. But I mean, a lot of what contemporary magic seems to be about, to me, is about. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping I'm not offending anyone, but it's the sacralization of the self. That seems to be a kind of dominant theme that runs through a lot of it. And Lovecraft is sort of saying, well, the self is insignificant.
It's super science. It was so super that we can't understand
it. Exactly, yeah.
Okay, Robin's had his hand up, but Renaud hasn't had a question yet, so we're going to defer to you.
Hi, I was just curious. I mean, how you've already kind of explained that you haven't really sort of sorted it out yet. But how would you go about reconciling your newfound kind of agnosticism with Necronomicon? I mean, I guess you can go back to the biblical tree of knowledge, and the core concept of forbidden books isn't new per se. But I guess that you have to. I mean, like a lot of it all, it does seem to kind of seize people's imagination. I wouldn't have thought of it if it wasn't the fact we were discussing kind of archetypes earlier in the day and the importance of secrecy in magic, or the way that it has kind of picked it up. And I was wondering to what extent you thought maybe the Necronomicon was sort of like a Lovecraft's nod to that aspect of knowledge. That the more you kind of, the more secret and inaccessible it is, the more powerful it becomes. And so this idea that you have a book that's so inaccessible that you couldn't actually read it for fear that it might actually destroy you, creates a knowledge so intense that actually, if you could somehow seize it, it would grant you power so incredible and so on and so forth. I mean, how do you, what real life, per se, I mean, literary, let's say, or academic echoes could you attribute to Necronomicon? How would you do it?
Well, I don't know if this is really an answer, and it's something I've actually been dying to talk about in these talks, but I haven't really left myself time. And I'll touch on it briefly now, and hopefully address it in the final session. And it isn't actually an answer to that particular question, but it is in a similar sort of area. Basically, my approach here is to, as I think I've said before, the reality of the Necronomicon is, that's, if you take that as your kind of, Bible, well, there's no, what is the Bible but a collection of fictions? So that is not a sort of issue to me in some respects, although I'm kind of critical of it. what interests me here is the intersection between the human propensity for magico-religious belief, or the belief in other worlds or whatever, and the capacity for the imagination and the capacity to create poetry, fiction, metaphor, so on and so forth. So, to cut this very short, what I'm sort of getting at here is that I think the Necronomicon and Lovecraft more generally as a kind of accepted mythology, if you like, is a really interesting way of investigating the evolutionary foundations of human cognition. I mean, basically, my thinking here is that about 40,000 years ago, we had this apparent sort of cultural explosion amongst human beings, and this seems to be facilitated by what some writers have called cognitive fluidity, which is the ability to, in a sense, mix domains of thought, which might not have been an ability prior to that moment in time. This meant that you could then think of animals as being human beings. Whereas prior to this point, the argument goes, and it's highly speculative, the argument is that human beings prior to that simply could not conceptualize animals as having human-like consciousness. But once you have the ability to do that, I mean, that's the ability for metaphor, for creativity, and it also allows the flourishing of language, and all these things allow religion to flourish as well. With language you have the idea of a past and future, past, present and future. When you have the future, you can conceptualize alternative moral worlds. You can conceptualize moral systems and so on and so forth. I don't know if this is making any sort of real sense, but I think for me at this point in time, and it isn't really an answer to a question, the usefulness of this is really as a kind of a reflection on how the human mind works.
Okay. One last question. Robin.
Okay. Well, I was just going to literally. I think Asimov or Clark who said that, like any future science is effectively magic. You can't understand it. That's the great. But going back to the idea of mythology and constructing mythology, you have to remember that Lovecraft wasn't writing on his own. He was using a lot of other writers' mythologies within his own work deliberately. There was a cohesive, ideal mythology that they're all working towards, which wasn't necessarily cohesive, but it interjected into each other and blended with reality on many fronts. And I think this is where it captures the imagination and why people run with it so easily, is that it is rational in many respects, in that it's generally dealing with a modern day naturalistic approach to discovering something abnormal and unusual. And I think that it's one of the reasons why his writing is carried on into modern writing, very much so. But specifically to the question, to what you were talking about like cognitive ability and how we rationalise things, I think that's an awful lot to do with symbology and how we humans specifically developed symbolic thinking as a way of communicating. Generally down to being scavengers in Africa 6 million years ago. But it's symbolic thinking is very key to Lovecraftian writing, and being able to understand that form of thinking is actually quite alien to nature. It's not a normal way of thinking. And that expresses itself quite heavily in a lot of his writing. Most of his alien creatures are, in fact, of the scientist ilk. They're not. Yes, absolutely, yeah. They're not monstrous in that they the degenerate stories, the ones he talks about, degenerate humans, which are generally white, incidentally, are the stories which are very much your boy's own stories. But his more interesting stories are very much dealing with this non-humanity that is very scientific and mythological in its way of thinking. And
hold on, okay, good. We're going to pause for a breath now. Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if there was a question coming out of that.
Right, yeah.
No, I mean, again, yeah. I mean, fall back on my default position, I would entirely agree. I mean, I think it's interesting though, because in the Mountains of Madness, there is this kind of section where he's referring to the old ones, which are no longer these monstrous godlike beings, but actually just extraterrestrial beings. They are far in advance of human beings. But he refers to them, as you say, as scientists, but also as men, which is kind of interesting, actually. There is a kind of element of almost humanising them as well.
Shadow at the Time is a very good example of that, of the humanising of the
yes, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's right. I think one of the things, just as a kind of general response, is I think maybe I try and do this with the final talk, is to maybe perhaps cut the talk down a little bit and leave more time to have more of a kind of forum rather than, because I do find it very difficult to kind of respond in any kind of accurate or meaningful way to many of your questions, other than again to say yes, I agree.
We're too modest. Maybe.
Probably.
I think I'm conscious of the time, and for all the contributions and comments. Thank you. I mean, comments and contributions. You just go, yes, it's fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong if you just go, it's perfectly fine.
I think it's that sort of academic environment where you have to defend your position.
We're much more collaborative than that here.
Yes.
Just before we go, there's a couple of announcements to say. There are a limited number of places left for the last two talks. So it makes us weak to turn people away. So, please, if you want to come to the next two, I'm in the position of having to say, please sign up. Please sign up tonight if you know you can come. Also to say, I think with your recommendation of the Necronomicon files, if you don't have a copy, you'd like us to order you one in, we'll take a list tonight at the desk, and we'll get them in and give you a ring, and you can pick it up anytime you like, or in a fortnight, or we'll post it. And then you mentioned the Lamb and Kenneth Grant. If there's any Kenneth Granty fans here and saw the picture of Lamb, the functioning head of the Typhonian OTO, who's just otherwise known as Mick, is doing a full day working with Lamb, and he's in a very in a kind of very Grantian Lamb lodge, and has been for I think 20 years. So if you're interested in Lamb and Kenneth Granty things, again, that's the 10th of March, but really it's less than 10 places left, so it might be about 7 or 8. So if that's something that would float your boat, you are the crowd for me to tell. I think that's it for announcements. So apart from save your questions, your comments. You're all fascinating people. Do yourself a favour if you can, and that is feel free to introduce yourself. Please do, to 2 or 3 people you've not met before. You're probably the most interesting people in London. You're all under one roof, and you all have an interest in this. So you're worth getting to know. I'm here to tell you. I know most of you a little bit. Last thing before we go upstairs, please join me and thanking Justin for a fabulous.
If you're interested further in what I've been saying tonight, or the previous talk, there probably won't be a audio file of this. I will be turning all this into a PDF with actually long-term plan of turning it into a book, hopefully. But it'll be up on my blogspot, which
we'll
have a word with me later on.
We'll send you. Okay.
Justin Woodman lectures in social anthropology at Goldsmiths College, University of London, where he completed his doctoral thesis on chaos magic in 2003. He also lectures at Birkbeck College and the University of Westminster. Dr. Woodman has contributed articles on Lovecraftian themes to Strange Attractor and the Journal for the Academic Study of Magic, and is one of the founding moderators of the Lovecraft Scholars Yahoo group. Justin is also a keen player of Call of Cthulhu and a regular lurker at yoxothoth.net.